Thank you. So I wanted to expand this idea of diversity beyond what it is we've been talking about so far. And one of the ways in which we can do this is to talk about LGBTQ students, staff, and faculty. And the situation for LGBT folks at the moment is quite interesting. There's very little research being done on LGBT folks in STEM. There's quite a lot of campus climate studies that have been done, so a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking to you about today is out of these campus climate studies, but actually looking at how we exist in STEM and whether we're properly represented and properly supported, there's very little data on that. What we do know is we seem to be a little bit underrepresented, and a large number of people are not out. So a large number of people who are working in the STEM subjects are closeted. And this can be, the LGBT community is quite unique in that we're a very invisible community. You can't tell from simply looking at somebody whether they're LGBT, and that makes our challenges a little bit different from the other communities we've been talking about. So I want to start off with a bit of LGBT 101, so we're all on the same page, we know what we're talking about. So just to go through the acronym very quickly, the L stands for lesbian, which is just women who are attracted to other women. The G is gay, which is men who are attracted to other men. B is bisexual, men and women who are attracted to both men and women. T is transgender, and I want to spend just a second on this because this is something that people get confused by. A transgender individual is somebody whose internal gender identity, the way they perceive their gender on the inside, does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. The opposite of that is something we call cisgender. So if you're a woman and you feel like a woman, then if you're born female and you feel like a woman, then you are cisgender. Born male, feel like a male, you are cisgender. The important thing to note about trans folks is that they're not necessarily lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So in some ways, it's odd to lump them into this umbrella, and their needs are very, very unique, even amongst the LGBT community. And so a lot of the programming that happens in universities beautifully matches the LGBT stuff and completely misses the T stuff. And so they're a real, very under-researched minority. The Q stands for questioning, which is people who are questioning their sexual orientation and or gender identity, and that's a perfectly valid identity. They can be questioning for as long as they like. Nobody should be insisting that they choose. It can also stand for queer, which is an umbrella phrase which is used to describe the LGBT community. Whatever you do, be careful when you use the word queer. It used to be a very derogatory term. It's been reclaimed by the young community and is now used to describe the queer community, queer theory, queer research. However, if you use it to anybody over the age of 40-ish, you're likely to get hit. So be very, very careful how you use it. Never ever use it to describe a person, only ever use it to describe a community. Okay? So never call somebody queer unless they have self-identified that way. So what are the issues? Well, campuses are generally hostile to LGBTQ students, staff, and faculty. We know this. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who I tell this to who go, not my campus. My campus is great. We're super loving. We love everybody. And 90% of straight people in universities feel absolutely the same way. If they did a campus climate survey, Sue Rankin did a campus climate survey in 2010, 90% of straight folks said, yep, our campuses are awesome, they're super friendly. That same survey found that 74% of LGBT students say those same campuses are homophobic. Now, this is not a surprise. We see exactly the same thing with race and gender, exactly the same thing. But it's just important to note that even if you think your place is super, you're probably wrong. Almost a quarter of the people surveyed reported verbal or physical threats, and more than half have concealed their identity to avoid harassment. LGBT scientists we know are less out than their counterparts in the humanities. Like I said, there's virtually no other research in terms of STEM. More than a quarter of LGBT staff and faculty report discriminatory hiring or promotional practices. So there's actually ingrained discrimination in the practices that the university is using. And quite often this is because practices and benefits and or policies interact with the law in some way. And I'll get into that a little bit later. And only about 40 to 60% report receiving equal benefits packages, again, often because they interact with the law, state law or federal law, in a way that causes a problem. This one should really scare us all. Even if none of the rest of it scares you, this one should really scare us, because LGBT youth are 4 times and trans youth are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. This stuff is literally a matter of life or death for the youth in our universities and in our society. So what can we do? Well, I'm going to go through a few things. First thing you can do is to be an educated ally, and this accounts for all diversity. First of all, never assume. You can't tell by simply looking at somebody how they identify. Never label somebody unless you've heard them use that label to apply to themselves before. Even then, take care in how you use that label. And respect other people's labels. However they identify, that is the way they identify, and that is not up to you to police how they identify themselves. If you know somebody has slept with both men and women, but they identify as gay rather than bisexual, not your place. It's entirely their decision, okay? And one of the reasons I talk about labels and not assuming is because the LGBT phrase that we use is simply the tip of the iceberg. And every single time we talk to youth in our universities, this extends. So actually, what I think the acronym now is, and I might be wrong, is this, okay? And this stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer, intersex, asexual, pansexual, omnisexual, two-spirited, agender, genderqueer, and gender fluid. And if you can remember that, you're doing better than 90% of the gay community, let me say that. But the point is that people are changing their identities on a pretty much monthly basis. And quite often the way these words are used changes. So the way that the word transgender has been used has changed. It used to mean somebody who literally changed their gender. It used to be synonymous with transsexual. It's now not. It can now mean anybody who just doesn't identify on the gender binary. So these words are changing meaning all the time. Speak up against homophobia. I would assume this is obvious, but so many people don't do it. They hear something thrown about in the classroom, that's so gay. That gets thrown around a huge amount in classrooms and on campuses. And it's homophobic, it makes people feel incredibly discriminated against. But people often say nothing because they don't know what to say, and they don't want to say the wrong thing. And I'm here to tell you right now, saying anything is better than saying nothing. Okay, even if you think you're going to put your foot in it, say something. Know the issues. There are many things that you really should know in order to properly support LGBT students. And amongst these are the fact you should never ever out someone, ever. Families are not safe. 40% of the homeless youth on our streets identify as LGBT. And this is because their own families have thrown them out of home. You can never ever assume that a student's family is a safe space for them. School bullying. About 80% of LGBT youth are bullied in schools. ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, that comes in a lot when we're talking about policies and benefits packages and this kind of thing, and I'll touch on that again in a moment. Marriage equality. Know where we're at with that. It's so disappointing. I remember going into work after Prop 8 got struck down, and I was like, I can get married. I can get married. You know what? I can get married. This is really freaking cool right now. I walked in and not a single person said anything to me. I'm like, oh. All right then, well I think this is really cool, but nobody noticed, and somehow that is kind of deflating, you know. Bear in mind that important things are going on in your gay colleagues' lives and be aware of them. And finally, pride. Recognize that with all the hardships that go with being LGBT, there's a huge amount of pride in the community. Understand where that pride comes from. Understand about the origins of that, about Stonewall, about why we celebrate Pride every year. And recognize it's not just about being proud that we're gay. That's not it. It's about being proud that we survived that last year without punching somebody on the nose, okay? So be aware of this stuff. Know your resources. If somebody comes into you, if a student walks into your office and comes out to you, what do? How do you respond to that? Who can you put them in touch with in the community? Are they ready to be put in touch with anybody in the community, or are they still questioning? You know, if you say, oh yeah, there's a department on campus that deals with that, go and see the Caltech Center for Diversity. Maybe they're not ready to walk into that space yet. Be aware of that, know your resources, know your crisis counseling numbers if students need it. And finally, keep learning. Like I said, I get trained about every 6 months. I volunteer with the Trevor Project, which works with suicidal LGBT youth. And I get trained every 6 months, and every 6 months we add a letter to this. So be aware that these things change. And the law is changing so rapidly at the moment with terms of marriage equality, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Title IX now covers transgender students. So be aware of how these things change. Second thing is know your audience. Your audience is not the same as my audience. The LGBT community at Caltech, not the same as the one at your university. So be aware of who is in your community. Let me ask you a question. How many members of the LGBT community are there in your institutions? Do you think it's 1 to 3%, 5 to 6, about 10, or none of the above? Have a show of hands. Who thinks it's 1 to 3? Yeah, In your community, what percentage of your community are LGBT?
Really quickly.
Yes.
Community as in, like, so in the lab, do you want all of Sizzle or do you want our group?
All of Sizzle.
Okay.
Yeah. In your institution. So in fact, all of NCAR. Let's go with that. Let's go with all of NCAR. Is it 1 to 3%? Who thinks it's 1 to 3? 1 to 3? Who thinks it's 5 to 6? Who thinks it's about 10? Okay. Who thinks none of the above? Does anybody who thinks it's none of the above want to tell me why you think it's none of the above?
And what I see visually is at least of those who are LGBTQ are still in the closet.
Anybody else?
I just think about my colleagues that say
Are LGBT? Wow. I want to come where you work. The answer is none of the above. And the reason is we have no idea, because we don't count them. Not only do we not count them when they come in, pretty much zero universities or institutions ask this question. We don't ask. Also, it changes. A student who walks in straight in their first year, in their freshman year, by their senior year could identify as LGBT. So we need to be asking this question. We need to be asking early, and we need to be asking often. This is not a question you can ask once, because the situation is so fluid. So don't be afraid to ask. Ask early, ask often. Encourage your institution to ask when students arrive. Second is survey your campus and departmental climate. You have no idea how LGBT folks are doing until you ask them. And a lot of them are in the closet and so won't come out and tell you that you're doing horrible things. So, ask the questions. And apart from anything else, a survey shows that you care, and that people tend to then respond to that and feel more comfortable in the space. Number 3, create a safe space. Best way of creating a safe space, in my opinion, and in the opinion of much research, is to do safe zone training. And safe zone training is basically LGBT 101. It takes place usually over a couple of lunchtimes. And at the end of that time, which just covers things like what the acronym means, what we mean by transgender, what do we mean by gender identity and gender expression, what are the issues going on. At the end of that time, you get a sticker to stick on your office door. And people say, well, what's the point in this? How does this help? I can tell you, seeing safe zone stickers on doors immediately creates safe space for students. Students walk around the entire time, staff and faculty as well, navigating safe spaces. And when you can walk into an office and you see the sticker on the door and you know this person accepts you for who you are and is not going to be judging you, is only going to be wanting to talk to you about your science, that is a huge thing. It allows you to take off the armor and lay it at the door and have the conversation. In that space, you're safe. And this is a huge deal for students. Include the students in your safe zone training. I will say safe zone training should be mandatory, in my opinion, for everybody. I think it should certainly be mandatory for everybody who has contact with students. It should certainly be mandatory for anybody who has contact with vulnerable students. So TAs, RAs, anybody in student services, anybody in security, people in athletics. I think all those people should have training. The reason we need to include the students, about 80% of harassment on campuses comes from students, which is a depressing number when you think that 20% comes from grown-ups on campus. But 80% is students. We need to include them in our training. We should be querying our non-discrimination policy. What I mean by that is most non-discrimination policies now include sexual orientation. Very few include gender identity or gender expression. So very simple thing you can do, just make sure it's included in there. And finally, create clear harassment policy and procedures. About 40% of people who reported in the campus climate study said that they do not believe that their institution has either clear or effective harassment policy procedures, and that they never get followed through. So again, an important thing to think about in your space. And this is true for departments as well as institutions, even if you're not at the institutional level. 4, blend agenda. What I mean by this is we need to get rid of this notion that gender is binary. It's not male-female. Gender is this whole blender of all different types, and it runs the entire gamut from male all the way through to female, everything in between. The best way we can support transgender students, who are deeply unsupported on all our institutions right now, is to just get rid of it wherever possible. If you don't need to make this a gendered space, don't do it. If you don't need to ask the question on a form, don't ask it. Ask yourself, do you really need to know this, or is this something that we can leave off? Please banish male-female from forms and paperwork. This does not fit a significant fraction of our students, okay? Better to, if you desperately need a checkbox that says male, female, have a third checkbox that says other and allow people to write it in. If you have a drop-down menu, include gender queer, gender fluid, transgender, include other things as well. Better still, just let them write it in, okay? It causes hell with trying to actually sort your data into boxes because students don't like to be boxed, however. It's better not to box them at point of entry. Create all gender bathrooms. One of the most dangerous spaces for transgender people is public restrooms. They are very intimidating to folks who are transgender because they're not safe. Best thing you can do is to create all gender restrooms. Anything that is a single stall restroom is a transgender restroom. It's an all gender restroom. All you need to do is change the sign on the door. Okay? Better still, if you don't have any single stall restrooms in your place of work, set aside one entire floor. Just make it an all gender restroom. We do this at Caltech. Caltech housing now, pretty much all the houses only have all gender bathrooms, and that includes the showering facilities as well. And people say to them, are you not weirded out by this? And they're like, no, it's just like showering, in the same bathroom as my brother. It's not weird. It's just, we're family, and as we all need to shut the door. It's fine. So this is not as big a hurdle as everybody seems to think it is. Use gender-free language. Never assume that somebody's spouse is male or female. Simple as that. How to talk to transgender folks. If you're not entirely sure how somebody identifies, this is your question. What is your preferred gender pronoun? It's a perfectly respectful thing to ask. Better still, say, my preferred gender pronoun, my name is Carolyn, my preferred gender pronoun is she, her, hers. What is your preferred gender pronoun? Okay, that's how you do it. It's he, him, his, she, her, hers, and they will then tell you how they identify and how they would like to be addressed. Usually it's one of those two, or it's there, or you occasionally come across the z, zim, ziz, very occasionally. Queer your support services and policies. Have a procedure for changing name and gender. This procedure is perfectly easy to implement. Many places do it. It's not as hard as everyone thinks it is. But it does have to be absolutely hermetically sealed confidential, and it has to be retroactive. If somebody changes their gender halfway through their course, it needs to apply all the way back through their transcripts. And the reason for this is this map right here. All the white states on here, it is still perfectly legal to fire somebody simply because they are gay or transgender. In the purple states, it's still perfectly valid to fire somebody if they are transgender. It's only in the gold states on there that we have protections for both LGBT and T individuals. So if somebody calls up wanting a student's transcript and they get it back saying that and see that the gender has changed on there, then you are potentially costing a student a job or getting them fired from where they are. So bear that in mind. It absolutely has to be confidential and retroactive. Check whether your benefits package is equal. When you're hiring people, are they getting the same benefits as their straight peers? A lot of the time, benefits packages conflict with the law, and so you've got to be very, very careful, or they interact in a way that causes extra tax burdens or all kinds of things. So be aware of how your benefits package interacts with the law in your state. If it interacts in a way that costs people something, then see if you can compensate for it. Until recently, in the state of California, married couples had to file in the state as a couple, but federally separately. And so it created this whole tax mess, which caused great problems when it came to bringing people onto their health insurance. So be aware of that. Does your institutional healthcare cover transitioning? College is a real important time for transgender students because quite often it's the first time they've been able to think about transitioning. And so it's really important that institutional healthcare does cover that. Most places don't. Your university healthcare probably doesn't. The only place I know that does is the UC system, and this was instigated last year. It was brought into effect. So, yay UC. And finally, do counselling staff have experience in LGBT issues? So often our students go for counselling and they just don't have anybody they can talk to, especially the trans students. Ask the question. If they don't, try and push the university to get extra counselling staff on if they can, or change somebody on the counselling staff. And finally, work to change institutional culture. And the one thing I would love to banish is this idea of science first. And what I mean by science first is this phrase that so many STEM institutions have where they say, we don't care what background you're from, as long as you're a great scientist, that's all we care about. It sounds so uplifting. and so inclusive, and yet is the most least inclusive thing that I can possibly think of saying. Because what an LGBT student hears when they hear this is, we don't care about you. We don't care about your identity. All these things that you're struggling with your identity, they're not part of a scientist. If you're struggling with this, you're not a proper scientist. You need to be concentrating on your science alone and not thinking about all this other stuff. And so it's incredibly damaging to LGBT kids in our universities, and to the staff and faculty as well, frankly, when we can't bring our entire identities into our jobs. And talk about it. The thing about the LGBT community, as I said, is that we're invisible, mostly. And the more we talk about it and the more we champion LGBT rights, and the more universities actually say the great things they're doing for LGBT folks, the better. Because universities have this tendency to be very reticent about this stuff. They don't want to offend stakeholders. They don't want to offend religious communities. They don't want to offend, the guy who's giving them $1 million who happens to, be quite homophobic. But we still need to be talking about it because we need to make these spaces safe. So, like I said, visibility breeds awareness. Awareness breeds allies. Allies create safety and belonging. And belonging leads to awesome science, where everybody can be a scientist and be the best possible scientist they can. So in conclusion, be an educated ally, know your audience, ask early and often, create safe spaces, get rid of gender as much as possible, queer policies, and let's adopt this holistic culture. And my question to you is, how can we as a community of scientists tackle this science-first culture? How do we eradicate that? So thank you.
And first, just
hi. Yeah, one of the great talk. One of the best postdocs I ever had was lesbian, and she's faculty now at the University of Iowa. And I know, fortunately, the ideal job for her matched up with Iowa, and I stood up for her at her wedding and everything else. It was great. But I'm wondering, I know she feels rather isolated there, and I'm wondering, is there an organization of LGBTQ faculty and such that might be good for her to contact and kind of get some support?
For faculty specifically, not that I know of. There definitely are for STEM scientists. Nogglestep is one of the big ones. Don't ask me to spell that. It's Nogglestep, NGLSTP, and it's the National Gay and Lesbian Science and Technology Professionals. And so that's a really good place to go and get, support and resources. For students, there's a new society opened up called OSTEM, which is the student version of the same thing. Yeah.
so I had a question, and I'm actually going to bounce this one back again. But in all of our reporting, we are, in our efforts to try and improve our gender diversity, we are asked to ask gender.
Mm-hmm.
I recently changed all of our questionnaires, because we have to report this and have to ask, with which gender do you choose to identify, and then decline to state. But clearly I should also have a fill-in.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I know that the choice of gender identity was a better way to put it. But if I didn't have to report it, then I really could leave it out.
Right. And it's totally fine to, everybody needs to report back, and we understand that. And this is why, quite often you need gender on there. I would actually rephrase your question slightly. Instead of saying choose, it suggests it's a choice, people's gender identity. I would say, what is your gender identity? Just what? Yeah, no, I wouldn't say pronoun, because that confuses the straight people. Just say, what is your gender identity? And actually, you can have checkboxes for male, female, and other. And then, the people who are straight don't get confused because they see the MF that they're expecting. But the trans kids, or the people who identify as something different, two-spirited, genderqueer, gender fluid, or whatever, get to write in whatever they choose. You're welcome.
So you mentioned this early on, and I'll try to make it a question come out of it. So hang with me. But obviously, we're talking about two different things: sexuality and gender.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a bad question, and then you clean it up and answer it however you want. So if you were going to push one as where we need to most move, it seems to me the tendency would be to say, well, we're not really asking anyone to define their sexuality so openly, so let's just put that aside and really focus on the gender. Is that a bad way to look at this? I think you pointed out that there's that clumping together that maybe shouldn't happen.
I think this clumping together that is detrimental to trans youth. I think the issues facing LGB and trans youth in universities are very different. I think that there are many more institutional roadblocks to trans youth. We know that LGBT students generally have very good interactions with support services and student services. Trans youth do not. LGBT students generally have very good interactions with health services and counselling. Trans students do not. So I think there are different areas. There are different things we should be concentrating on for LGBT youth versus T youth. I think, like I said, the institutional roadblocks are the big ones for transgender youth. We can make their lives so much easier simply by, making things easier, getting out of the way. Whereas LGBT youth, I think, require, and trans youth as well, everybody requires more of a community and a more understanding and more education around what it means to be LGBT. Because most of the students say, when we ask them, do you think that your instructors understand, what it means to be LGBT? The first thing they do is laugh. It's like, no, nobody's ever told them. They don't know, they don't understand. And quite often, instructors are, I hope, accidentally, committing microaggressions in class. And they need to be trained out of it. For both, especially for gender. But definitely for sexuality as well, yeah.
I'm going to ask a question because I'm holding the microphone. No, just let me ask the question, and we got time for this. There's this issue about STEM not being studied, and I didn't feel like I got a clear explanation why that is. Is it just an oversight? Is that an area that we could make a recommendation here? Because
I think that
it seems strange to me, that we're not studying that.
We're studying it in terms of climate. There have been a few climate studies on departmental climates. I think actually the reason that people aren't studying it is because the people doing the research are social scientists and humanities folks, and they find easier access to social sciences and humanities departments rather than STEM departments. I think actually that's all it is. There have been a couple of studies done recently on the Queer in STEM study, and as far as I know, that is the only study that's been done on LGBT representation in STEM industry and STEM subjects as a whole. So we're well behind on this.
Can I give you this mic and take that mic off of you?
You certainly can.
And take that mic off.
I really like the safe zone concept.
Yeah.
And would love to do that training and have that sticker on my door. I've never heard about that at University of Wyoming, so where do I look? I mean, I don't know if that program's available. If it's not, where do I?
It's a real good question. I mean, you really want this to happen at your university as much as possible. So my recommendation to you would be to go, do you have a diversity centre there? Yeah, go and talk to them about it, and they should be able to bring somebody in to do safe zone training. It's a very well-known thing now. A lot of universities have it, so they shouldn't be too surprised.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes. I don't know about AAAS's work in this area. I was asked, do I know about AAAS's work in this area? No, I don't actually. I should look into it.
Okay.
Have active membership? Yeah. Sorry, one more, sorry.
I nicked it, sorry. Two different thoughts, and then I'll ask you both questions and see if you can get to them. But first is I'd like to hear you expand a little bit on this idea about changing science first, because in fact, I have some thoughts in my head, just even based on the past several days of discussion, that makes me kind of resistant to that. So I'm curious for you to expand on that a bit. And then the other issue I find myself thinking about is I went to a women's college, and I know I've seen actually some recently some articles in the New York Times about particularly how our women's college is going to address and think about transgender students. And I'm thinking about the blender gender aspect too, and there's a fairly strong history amongst women's colleges and some I wouldn't count myself among them, but definitely very adamant women that are going to be very fierce in protecting the history of women's college and saying that is a space that should continue to exist. And so I'm a little bit curious if there's what your training is and your perspective on the LGBT and the rest of the acronym response to both women's colleges and then expanding a little bit more on science first.
So let me take the women's college question first. This is a really interesting question, and it's something that's been started to come up a lot, especially as students who are in women's colleges decide to transition, or individuals who were born male decide to transition and want to then go to women's colleges. But it's also a conversation that's been happening a lot, even before we talk about college. You know, women's festivals, for example, have been a huge hotbed of discussion about this. I think that the place that everybody's settled on is if you identify as a woman, you should be allowed into women's colleges. That is where it lands. And I think that is the place that everybody has come to as the agreement, you know, is the fair thing to do. If you don't identify as a woman, you don't get to go to women's college, simple as that. The difficulty comes when somebody who is at a women's college decides to transition to male. And I think that's the situation that Scripps has found themselves in recently, and there's been a huge amount of debate going on there. And the student in question, I believe, decided to transfer to one of the other Claremont colleges. Yeah. The science first. Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one for people to grasp, right? It sounds like a really good thing, saying that we don't care about your background, we don't care about your race, your, gender, whatever. All we want you to be is a good scientist. But this leaves people's identities at the door. This means that you can't be whole people in science. And when we're talking about diversity, we need to bring in true diversity, and this is what I mean by this. And asking LGBT students to forget that they're LGBT is just, it's not possible for them. And they're struggling so hard with their identities sometimes that to have their entire university turn around and say, we don't care about that, can be very, very damaging to them, in that they feel that it's something they don't have a chance to explore, and they're not being valued as whole people, but only for the very narrow piece of science that they can do. But we can talk more about this.
Yeah.